Hello, my name is Max Dolcelli, and I have been a professional stand-up comedian for 40 years. Well, up until March, when all the clubs, theaters, Broadway, Vegas, cruise ships all closed down. There is not a comedian working in the country. Well, they have tried shows in parking lots and movie theaters, the drive-in movie theaters, but you can't hear the laughter, but you can hear the people beeping when they heckle. So I don't, I hope that the business comes back. Anyway, I started in 1979, December of 1979, at a club in Manhattan called Catch Rising Star on First Avenue. Rick Newman was the owner of Catch Rising Star. Now, the reason I started doing stand-up comedy was I was involved in a off-Broadway show, and the star of the show was a an actor named Divine. How many people out there remember Divine? He was in the show Hairspray, the movie Hairspray. He played the mother, and he was very popular at the time, and he passed away since, unfortunately. But anyway, Divine took the cast one night to a club in Manhattan on Second Avenue called the Comic Strip, and I remember the comedians that night very well. One of the comedians was named Larry Miller. And he was very funny. He was the first comic we saw. The second guy that went up was a comedian named Uncle Dirty. We became very friends. I mean, in fact, I became friends with all these guys eventually. But the thing about Uncle Dirty, a lot of people don't know, his real name is Robert Altman, but he went by the name of Uncle Dirty. He started doing stand-up way back in the 60s, and he performed. He toured with the Grateful Dead. He had a very popular album back in the 60s, and he was very influential on another comedian named George Carlin. Have you ever heard of him? In fact, if you go to the website, The Real Uncle Dirty, and you'll see a letter that George Carlin sent him thanking him. And also, he signed it, "Your greatest pupil." So he was he was kind of a trailblazer. He did a lot of that hippie stuff way back. He used to perform at the Fillmore East, if anybody remembers the Fillmore East. He used to open for rock bands there. Anyway, that night, then there was another comedian that went up after Uncle Dirty, some comic named Jerry Seinfeld. Has anybody heard of him? Whatever happened to him? Anyway, I remember that night very well because I remember thinking, I'd like to try that. I really would like to try that. And I called around, and my friends told me, well, the club that you should go to was a place called Catch Rising Star, which is a very popular club. So I called up Catch Rising Star, and the manager told me that audition night was Monday night, and so I went there Monday night, and I saw the sign in the front that said Rick Newman's Catch Rising Star, and I walk into the club and I said, "Can I speak to Mr. Newman?" And some guy pointed him out, and I walked over to him and I said, "Hi, my name is Max Dolcelli. I prepared 5 minutes of material. I'd like to go on tonight to audition." And he started laughing at me. He said, "Don't you know what you have to do?" I said, "I'm about to find out, aren't I?" He said, "Yeah, what you have to do is get to the club around 4 a.m. and the first 20 people in line get numbers at 8:30 in the morning when the manager comes out and hands out numbers. And if you're not one of the first 20, don't bother, just go home." I said, "Oh, wow, okay." But then he said, "But I like you." And then he called the manager, and the manager was named Peter, and he said, "Peter, give this guy number 5 for next week." I'm like, oh, wow, this is great. I love show business. Anyway, the other auditioners, and one of them was a comedian named Bill Maher. They didn't like that. They had to wait in line. But we became friends. And then the following week, I auditioned, and the MC was a comedian named Richard Belzer, who said, "You're number 5." Number 5 came out to the bar, and he said, "Number 5?" I said, "That's me." He goes, "Okay, you're on next, babe. What's your name?" I said, "Max Dolcelli." He looks at me and goes, "I'm going to bring you up as Max." I said, "Okay." He goes, I'm going to go up for about 3 or 4 minutes and I'm going to bring you up. I said, okay. So I'm standing in the wings waiting to be introduced. 20 minutes later, I'm like sweating and trying to remember my act. I'm thinking, what am I going to do? And I was literally about to leave because I was so nervous. And it sounded like it came from a tunnel. I heard the word coming up to the stage next, Max. And he looks at me and and I felt like I was in a different dimension, walking on stage. And the audience was in a different realm. It was just bizarre. And I walked up to the microphone and I was trying to remember my first line. And then I looked down and there was a woman sitting, the room was packed. A woman was sitting up front with her date and she had the ugliest dress on I had ever seen. And I don't know what compelled me to sit. And I looked down, I said to her, you probably spent, an hour, 2 hours getting ready for tonight's date, and this is the best you can come up with? The audience exploded with laughter. And it felt like everything all the stress and I came back to reality, and it just felt so good. That big first laugh. And then I went into the material that I prepared, and it wasn't as good as the first laugh, but I survived, and it bit me. And Rick Newman said, "Come back next week." And I became friends with a lot of other comedians and at the club, and guys like Seinfeld. And I remember going in there every night, and it was one of these magical places where every night I'd walk in and there would be celebrities everywhere, guys like David Brenner and Robin Williams, John Belushi, Billy Crystal. Every night there was, and I wish I had taken a camera with me. Nobody had cell phones back then and cameras, but I really wish I had cameras with me because it was just amazing. And after a while, you thought, well, it'll always be this way. No, I remember one night walking in and Ilya Kazan and Jerzy Kaczynski were sitting at the end of the bar, and I'm a big Kazan fan. He made some of my favorite movies, A Face in the Crowd and, On the Waterfront. The guy was amazing. And I walked, and I kind of floated towards him, and I said, "Mr. Kazan, I'm a big fan." And he said, "Thank you." That was it. And then I turned to Mr. Kaczynski. I said, "And I'm a big fan of yours too." And he looks at me like, "Yeah, okay." Yeah, you had to say that, but I did for that reason. Anyway, I worked there, and then I just kept referring. Then I started working at a club in Brooklyn called Pips. Now, a lot of people don't know. I've ever heard of Pips. I'm sure some people have it. And it was a very famous kind of, in the business, it was a famous club. In fact, I'm wearing an original Pips Comedy Club t-shirt that George Schultz, the owner of the club, gave me back in 1979. I actually went to Pips right after Catch Rising Star because somebody said, if you go to Brooklyn, the guy will pay you $5. I thought, $5? Wow, to go on stage. And that's my first paycheck was $5 at Pips. And George was a comedian, and he used to perform in the Catskills back in the 50s. And his best friend at the time was another comedian named Jack Roy, whose real name was Jacob Cohen. And George Schultz went under the name of Georgie Starr. So him and Jack Roy performed, but they weren't that funny. In fact, George once told me, he said, "I quit the business because I sucked." And so did Jack Roy. Now, the thing about Jack Roy, a lot of people already probably know who he is. Some people don't, who I'm speaking to right now. Jack Roy was a stand-up comic, and he didn't do very well. He was okay, funny, and then he quit the business and started selling aluminum siding. He went into the aluminum siding business, and his friend George Schultz went into to Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn and opened up a club called Pips, which was basically the first comedy club in the country, their first true just comedy club in the country. And it was in Brooklyn, Sheepshead Bay, which was a really tough neighborhood, really tough. In fact, the first time I ever went on stage at Pips, I remember it well because the MC was a comedian named John Mulrooney. And I'm standing there waiting to go on stage. And I'm young. I've only been in the business for a week, 2 weeks, maybe. I only did a couple of audition nights at Catch. And I'm standing there, and this guy, he's got the chains around his necks, and his girlfriend is sitting next to him, and she's got all the poofy hair. Real Guido, if anybody knows what a Guido is. He looks at me, and he goes, "Hey, you on next?" I said, "Yeah, that's, yeah, mm-hmm." He says, "You better be freaking funny or you're dead." Well, apparently I was funny that night because I ain't dead. Except you didn't use the word freaking, but I'll just leave it at that. Anyway, George opens up this club in Brooklyn, and a lot of people actually started there. David Brenner started there, and Billy Crystal started there. A lot of very famous comedians worked Pips. Guys, almost every comic that you've heard of used to go into Pips. And then one day, his old friend came in and said, "I'm going back into the comedy business, getting out of the aluminum siding business," Jack Roy. And he said, "But I'm going to change my name." And he came up with the name. Now, I was told, now, a lot of these things are things that I was told. Now, I was told that they chose the name from an old Jack Benny character on his TV show called Rodney Dangerfield. There was a character, a bad guy on the TV show, or the radio show. I don't remember, it was a radio TV show, but it was a character called Rodney Dangerfield, and that's where they chose the name Rodney Dangerfield. So, and then this is another thing that George told me, that he said to Rodney, "Why don't you just take my old tagline, which was, 'I don't get no respect,' because it never worked for me. Maybe it'll work for you." Now, I knew Rodney well because Rodney used to hang out at the clubs all the time. I've got a great Rodney story, by the way. And I remember one night driving him to the Improv in Manhattan. We were at Catch Rising Star, and he said, "Hey, kids, you got a car, right?" I said, "Yeah," because I had a 1968 Chevy Impala convertible, and I lived in Jersey, so I would always drive back and forth to the clubs. And I gave him a ride down to the Improv, and I remember Rodney said, "I'm stopping at the red light." He goes, "Don't worry about it, go through. I know all the cops." I said, "Yeah," but he goes, "No, I know all the cops. Go ahead." I said, "Well, okay, Mr. Danger, I'm with Rodney Dangerfield. What am I supposed to say? No, I'm not going through the red light." But anyway, I kind of went through it right when it turned green. Anyway, I asked him that night when we were driving, I said, "You remember George?" Because George was his best friend at one time. And I said, "George told me that he gave you the line, 'I don't get no respect.' Is that true?" And he immediately changed the subject. So, I was told by George and a bunch of other people that's where the line, originally where the line came from, but I'm not really sure. But George wouldn't lie about that. George was a really nice guy. He's also passed away as well since. Anyway, and the club, Pips, is closed now. It closed many years ago. And I'll tell you another very funny story that had to do with Pips. There was a comedian named Otto Peterson. He was a ventriloquist. How many people out there have ever heard of Otto and George? Now, if you have never heard of them, you can Google Otto and George. Now, Otto and George was the dummy. In fact, he was in the business. He was a legend because he literally opened the door for all the shock comics that you see and hear today. Guys that just go way over the edge, because he went over the edge way back. In fact, he was so popular that celebrities loved him. I remember working in Vegas at the Tropicana, and I'm walking down the strip, and there were flyers on the ground. People used to hand out flyers, and I looked out, and it was Otto and George at the Riviera. So I went to the Riviera that night. I called up Otto. I said at the hotel, I said, I'm going to come by. I'm going to bring the comics from the Trop. And he said, yeah, Max, don't worry. I'll leave their name at the door. So we walk in, and literally every celebrity in Vegas was there to see Otto and George. And I remember one night at Caroline's, David Copperfield was such a big fan of Otto and George that, in fact, the original George puppet is in David Copperfield's museum in Las Vegas. He's got a magic museum, and he's got the original George puppet there. But I remember going there, and I wanted to impress a cruise director that I was working with on cruise ships. So I take them to Caroline's to see Otto and George. And Copperfield is sitting in the table in front of us with a lot of beautiful, pretty, very pretty ladies. He's very popular, David Copperfield. He was magic, so he could, anyway. And then after watching George and Otto and George, and we went to the green room. I went to the green room with the cruise director. And I'm sitting there talking to Otto, and Otto's one of these guys that were on stage. He had all the guts in the world. He would say things. Well, he didn't really say it. The dummy said it, but he just had. Google Otto and George. I warn you though, he's very dirty, very politically incorrect, but he makes fun of everything. There are clips out there of him, many clips. In fact, I loaded one, Otto and George Rare. But anyway, we're sitting in the green room talking, and David Copperfield comes in, and he says to him, another great show, Otto. And I look up, and I said, you're David Copperfield. And he looks at me and goes, yes, I know. I'm thinking, could I have said anything stupider? No. Anyway, it's a very great story I'm going to tell you about Otto and George. All right. I'm working on ships, and I this was way back after I've been in the business for a lot of years. I'm working cruise ships, and I just got up. This is about 1991, 5, somewhere around there, 94. I don't remember the exact year, but anyway, I get home from a cruise ship, and I get a call from the owner of Pips. He says, "Hey Max, I need a comedian tonight to open." I said, "Really? I just got off a ship. I really don't want to drive to Brooklyn." And he goes, oh, it's too bad. I need somebody to work with Otto and George tonight. I said, oh, Otto and George. Now, Otto and George is someone that comics would stop and go watch. He was that influential and that shocking that what is he going to say next, Anyway, so I get to the club, and it was before the show, and I parked the car in Sheepshead Bay. Try to park it so I wouldn't get broken into. And I'm standing in front of the club with the owner of the club, who was named Mike at the time, and then the bartender was Ray Garvey, great guy. In fact, he booked the Borgata in Las Vegas for many years before he passed away. Comics loved him. And also the couple of the other acts, and there's about 4 or 5 of us standing in front of the club. And there was this guy pacing back and forth from the club to Joe's Clam Bar. And he's like muttering to himself. He's talking to himself. But, it's Brooklyn and it's New York. So weird people are all everywhere. So you really pay much attention to him, But he's pacing back and forth. Suddenly a taxi pulls up and Otto's in there. And he gets out of the taxi. And luckily, at that moment, the guy was way down by Joe's Clam Bar, and Otto is walking towards us. He's carrying the bag with George in it, and he's walking towards us, and this guy sees him, and he runs over to Otto, and he says, he goes, "Yo, you," and he starts swearing at him. He's like saying all these big guys. Last night, I was here with my friends, and you were making fun of my mother on stage. I would have ripped your head off and blah, blah, blah. He's like screaming at him. And Otto, without George, is like very timid, shy. He goes, well, what are you talking about? I don't remember what he he goes, what do you mean what I'm talking about? The guy goes, last night I was here with my friend. You were making fun of my mother. I should I want to beat, if it wasn't for your friends around here, I'd kick your freaking butt. And Otto's like, well, I'm really sorry. I didn't realize. He goes, wait a minute. Sorry's not going to do it. You're lucky your friends are here. I want to kick your butt, blah, blah, blah. And the guy wanted to beat him up, but he sees us. So, and then and Otto's like standing there very timid. He goes, I don't remember what part. In your act, remember in your act when you're making for my mother, I should kill you, you blah, blah, blah. And then the guy turns to walk away, and Otto, and this is an example of how insecure a comedian goes, says, then he goes, well, did you like the rest of my show? The guy turns around, he didn't even know what to say. His jaw dropped, and he's like standing there in shock, and then he just walked away. But that's an example of how insecure we are. We're worried about, well, did you like the rest of my show? Anyway, I'm going to tell you another very funny story. This happened back in the, I believe in the 90s, or maybe it was the late. And there was a club in the village called, it was a very popular club up until the pandemic, called the Comedy Cellar, and the comedian named Bill Grunfest opened up the Comedy Cellar, and I was one of the comedians that was working for him. And back then, it wasn't as popular as the uptown clubs like the Improv or Catch a Rising Star or the Comic Strip or Dangerfields. And what happened was he opens up the club, and he had trouble getting some comedians to work down there because it was down in the village. It was on McDougal Street. Parking really sucked, and you know, why would a comic want to go all the way down to the village? I mean, there were other clubs in the village like the famous Cafe Wah, where, by the way, Uncle Dirty and where that's where the club Cafe Wah. If anybody remembers the Cafe Wah, it was Manny Roth owned it, and Uncle Dirty was one of the comics there, and the other comedian Richard Pryor performed there, and George Carlin. Now, if everybody remembers George Carlin, when he used to do the old Ed Sullivan shows, he wore a tie and a suit, and he was very straight, and he just talked about generic stuff. But then he watched Uncle Dirty go up there, more of a hippie type comic, and talked about weird stuff. And that's why he signed it your best pupil, because that's where they worked together. Anyway, there were clubs down in the village, but back in the 90s, most of the other clubs closed up, and so the Comedy Cellar was like the only club there. Now, one night, I walk in, and Grunfest said to me, "Oh my goodness, one of the news stations, I forgot if it was ABC or CBS, but one of the big local news stations was coming in to do a story about the club that night." He says, "Max, I need a celebrity. If a celebrity can." So I said, well, you know what? At the time, Robin Williams was making the movie Moscow on the Hudson, or maybe it was Garp. But anyway, he was literally living in New York. And I said, let me go to Catch. And Robin's a really nice guy. He was really a nice guy. He would do things for people. I said, let me see if he's willing to come down here. So I drove up to Catch Rising Star, and I see Robin at the bar, and I said, there's a new club down in the village called the Comedy Cellar, and the TV people are coming down. And Robin said, yeah, why not? No problem. Yeah, sure, I'll do it. So we get in the car, and I have like I told you, I had a 1968 Chevy Impala convertible. The convertible top was down. It was summertime or spring, but anyway. We're driving down 2nd Avenue and to get to the village, and we're at a red light. And suddenly, out of nowhere, we hear a young lady screaming, "Mark! Mark! Mark!" And I look at Robin, I said, what's going on? And we looked to the left, and it was a limo. So apparently it was springtime, because the limos, a lot of the high school graduates would go to Dangerfields. They had prom nights at Dangerfield. And it was around that area of 2nd Avenue. So there was a young girl hanging out of a limo wearing her prom dress on, and she's hanging out. I don't know where she got a piece of paper and a pen, and she's hanging out of the limo saying, "Mork, give me your autograph." And I look at Robin. I said, can you believe this? I said, what do you want to do? He said, and Robin was a nice guy. He goes, I'll go out and give her my autograph. So he got out of the car and he walked over to the girl at the limo. And now the light's green and people are behind us beeping, but we're still sitting at the light. They could go around us because Second Avenue is a one-way street. Anyway, I'm sitting there at the light. Now it's green, and Robin is talking to her. He talked to her for about a minute and gave her the autograph. And he comes back and he sits in the car. Now the light's red again, and all of a sudden this girl screams, "That damn it, Mark! You misspelled my name. Get your ass back over here!" And Robin said, "Make a right, make a right, make a right." So we took off down, I don't remember what street it was. And I said, "You misspelled her name. What was her name?" He said, "Amy." I said, "You don't know how to spell Amy?" He said, "Amie, right?" I said, "Well, I guess maybe back in the 1800s, but now it's AMY. He goes, "Oh, okay." Anyway, that's a Robin Williams story. I've got a lot of other stories, but my time is pretty much up right now. It was a pleasure doing this for the library, and thank you very much for allowing me to present these stories about my career in show business, which will make a comeback. Thank you. My name is Max Dolcelli, stand-up comic. See, that's me. Have a great everything.